When we think about hospice documentation, it's so easy to just see it as paperwork, right? A box to check. But it is so much more than that. We're really talking about telling a story, a clear, consistent, and totally defensible story that proves your patient is eligible for the hospice benefit. Every single note, every signature, every assessment, it's all a chapter in that patient's story. And if that story has plot holes, well, it's not going to stand up to its toughest critics, the auditors. And believe me, the stakes are incredibly high. This chart shows us exactly where that story most often falls apart. I mean, look at this. A whopping 53% of all hospice claim denials are because the documentation, the story, fails to support the terminal prognosis. That's more than half. And then you add another 33% from what are basically simple paperwork errors with election notices. You can see pretty clearly that the vast majority of these expensive denials are completely preventable. So let's start where every story does, at the beginning. The opening chapter for every single hospice patient kicks off with two absolutely critical documents, the election statement and the notice of election. Now, they sound almost the same, right? But they do totally different things, and confusing them is one of the first and most common mistakes an agency can make.
Okay, let's break this down, because it's a super common mix-up. Think of the election statement as the patient's voice. They're part of the story. It's the legal document where they, or their representative, officially say, yes, I choose palliative care and I understand I'm waiving curative treatment for my terminal illness. The notice of election, or NOE, on the other hand, that's the agency's action. That's the form you file with Medicare to say, hey, this patient has chosen us, let's get their benefits started. So one is the choice, the other is the notification. Two very different things.
And speaking of that notification, there is a deadline you absolutely cannot miss. You have exactly 5, and I mean calendar days, not business days, to get that NOE filed after the patient's admission. If you miss that 5-day window, Medicare will not pay for the days from admission up until the day they finally accept the NOE. Those become what are called provider liable days, and that's a very expensive mistake to make right at the start of the story. All right, now we're getting to the real meat of the story. The core plot. This is the part that auditors look at with a microscope, and it's the reason for that huge 53% denial rate we saw. This is all about justifying the doctor's certification that the patient has a life expectancy of 6 months or less, assuming the illness runs its normal course.
And the absolute key to making this part of the story rock solid is what's called the physician narrative. Now, this is not just a copy-paste of the diagnosis. It's got to be a short, powerful summary from the physician that pulls together all the clinical facts, the lab results, the functional decline, the symptom burden, and weaves them into a clear reason for the prognosis. It needs to paint a vivid picture of this specific patient's condition.
And hey, don't just take my word for it. This isn't some nice-to-have best practice. It's a hard and fast rule. CMS themselves are crystal clear on this. They say the narrative must reflect the patient's individual circumstances. You know what that means? Auditors are specifically trained to sniff out boilerplate text. If your narrative looks like it could have been written for any patient, that's a giant red flag. The story has to be unique. Okay, so a story doesn't just end after the first chapter, right? It evolves. And with hospice care, the longer the story goes on, the more complex the documentation gets. So that brings up a really important question. What happens when a patient is still with you and enters their third benefit period, or any period after that? The answer? You don't need a mandatory face-to-face encounter. Yep. To keep the story going and to prove that the patient is still eligible for hospice, a hospice physician or nurse practitioner has to physically lay eyes on that patient. This is not optional, it is a required chapter in their story. And you guessed it, the timing here is absolutely everything. As you can see, that encounter has to happen within the 30 days before the start of that new benefit period. Then, the clinical findings from that visit are what the physician uses to write the recertification narrative. You follow this timeline to a T, and that's what makes the claim compliant and keeps the patient's story strong and defensible. So we've covered the big, dramatic plot points, the certifications and recertifications, but the real story is told day in and day out, in what I like to call the daily chapters. These are the visit notes from the entire team. Every single one of those notes has to reinforce that terminal prognosis. It has to show an ongoing, measurable decline, or at the very least, a clear failure to thrive. But this is also, unfortunately, where a lot of plot holes can sneak in. Let's look at some of these common mistakes. But let's translate them from that dense regulatory speak into what they actually look like in your charting. Forgetting to connect a patient's shortness of breath back to their end-stage COPD, that's missing the main story. Charting that all systems are within normal limits, but then writing a narrative about uncontrolled pain, that's giving contradictory cues. Or how about those vague notes like continued patient education? That's the continued trap. And the worst one, charting that creates the stable illusion, that's absolutely fatal in an audit.
Okay, so how do we avoid those plot holes? How do you write a daily chapter that's basically bulletproof? It's actually pretty simple if you follow this 5-step structure. Think of it as a mini story in every note. Start with the opening scene. Link how the patient is today to their diagnosis. Then present the evidence, your objective findings. Describe your RNA action. What skilled thing did you do? Detail the immediate outcome. How did they respond? And finally, map out the path forward by updating the plan of care. This formula turns a basic note into a powerful piece of evidence.
All right, so you've written your daily chapter, you've got your certifications in line, but how do you know, really know, that your story is ready to pass the test? This last section is all about giving you a tool, a kind of mental checklist you can use to give your own work a final review and make sure every patient story is audit ready.
Well, here it is. This is your audit-proof checklist. Think of these as the 10 non-negotiables, the questions you have to ask yourself before you hit sign. Is the story consistent? Does it always circle back to the terminal diagnosis, with no contradictions or those vague continued entries? Does it justify the care? Does it show why a skilled nurse was needed, that you dealt with meds, the care plan, and any weird findings? And here's the bottom line. Does the whole note taken together clearly demonstrate ongoing hospice eligibility? This checklist right here is your ultimate guide to telling that audit-proof story.
So, I want to leave you with one final thought, one question to really take with you. Is your documentation just another task on your to-do list? Or is it the final chapter of a well-told story? Because when you stop seeing documentation as just a chore and start seeing it as the final chapter in a patient's journey, a story that honors them and defends their right to this incredible care, man, that changes everything. Make every chapter count.